In this video, we're going to look at good and bad examples of rebuttal paragraphs. So as with the video on introductions, our topic is going to be, should the Electoral College system be replaced with a national popular vote? And we have the thesis here, which argues that it should be. So this is a paper that's for getting rid of the Electoral College and using a national popular vote to elect the president. All right, so I want to go through these lettered examples. And as I do, I want you to pause the video, read it, decide whether you think it's a good rebuttal or not based on what we talked about in the earlier video, and then I'll come back and give you my commentary. All right, so pause the video and read A. All right, A is not a good rebuttal paragraph. In fact, it's not a rebuttal at all. This is somebody writing here who doesn't understand what a rebuttal is. They think the primary purpose of a rebuttal is just to explain the other side's points, and that is not the primary purpose of a rebuttal. The primary purpose of the rebuttal is to say why one of the other side's points is wrong. So by just explaining all of the other side's points, they're not making an argument for their thesis, and they're just sort of giving a platform to the other side without explaining to the reader why the reader shouldn't therefore change sides. So this is not a good rebuttal paragraph. And it's surprising how often people make this mistake. One variation on this is sometimes people will have a sentence or two at the end where they say why the other side is wrong, but then they spend the majority of the paragraph explaining the other side. That's also not effective because you want the rebuttal paragraph to be primarily focused on saying why the other side is wrong. All right, let's look at B. So pause the video and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so B is also not a good rebuttal paragraph. For one thing, it doesn't narrow down the other side's point to a single point. That's what you want to do in a good rebuttal, is to just present a specific point that the other side's making and then rebut it. So this is just sort of a general characterization of the other side. It's not explaining one of the points of their argument. It's just sort of saying they're wrong because they don't understand democracy. And then the rest of the paragraph just kind of addresses all these different points without really explaining what the other side's premise is. It's sort of like responding to the other side's points without letting the reader of this paragraph know what that point is, and so you can't really follow the argument. So this is a failure as a rebuttal because it doesn't just focus on one of the other side's points, and it doesn't explain that point and then say why that one point is wrong. Because remember, a rebuttal only focuses on one point at a time of the other side, so you can really hone in. And this is just all over the place. And as you can see, there's just not time to address all these different points because you first have to explain what the point is and then explain why it's wrong and give the evidence, and this is trying to cram too much in, so it is not effective. All right, let's look at C. Pause the video, read that, and then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, C is also not a good rebuttal. It's better than the other two because at least it does set up one of the other side's points properly, saying the other side, which are the proponents of the Electoral College, and then it gives one of their points, that eliminating it would result in more vote recounts. The problem, though, is they shift to a totally different point. They don't rebut the point. The point they're bringing up is about recounts. So if this were going to be a good rebuttal paragraph, they would have to say, no, it won't result in more recounts. That's a rebuttal. Instead, they're changing the subject to a totally different point, which is saying the Electoral College isn't democratic. And that's what they end up talking about. Now, that might be a good point for them to make in the confirmation paragraph, but it's not a rebuttal of the other side's argument that eliminating the Electoral College would cause more recounts. So a rebuttal brings up one of the other side's points in order to show why it's wrong, not to change the subject to something else. And that's a very common problem I see with rebuttals, is people bring up one of the other side's points and then they shift to something else. And that's a failure as a rebuttal because you haven't knocked down the other side's point. And so as far as the reader's concerned, that point, maybe it's a good point. You haven't been able to say it's wrong, so it doesn't work as a rebuttal. All right, let's look at D. So pause the video, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, D is a good rebuttal paragraph, and let's talk about why. So we have part 1 here, where it explains the other side's point. I'm going to put that in purple. So the first sentence of that makes it clear that it's the other side that we're talking about, proponents of the Electoral College, because remember, this writer is against the Electoral College, so this is saying the other side, proponents of the Electoral College, claim that eliminating would result in frequent national vote recounts. So they're honing in on a specific point, just one point at a time that the other side is making, and they word it in a way that makes it clear that it's the other side's point, not the writer of this paragraph's point. Then, in this sentence, they have a name and a quote of someone from the other side who believes in that point, which is ideal to have. But we only have 2 sentences. You can't go too long here, because next we need to turn to rebut. And so the next thing we're going to have is our topic sentence, which is got a nice but kind of transition. However, using the popular vote would actually decrease the likelihood of any recount. So you need to boil down into just one sentence right after you explain the other side's point that summarizes why that point is wrong. And that can be a number of different reasons. The other side doesn't have the evidence, they're misinterpreting the evidence, which is what this would be, or it's not logical or not ethical. But anyway, you've got to settle on one overall reason why the other side's point is wrong. And then the rest of the rebuttal, the majority of it, is the evidence that shows that that point is wrong. And so you'll notice as reading through that, every single sentence in that green part is just about how eliminating the Electoral College would not cause more vote recounts. That's what a good rebuttal does. It just focuses only on showing why the other side's point is wrong. If you want to address another point of the other side, that's fine, but then you've got to do it in its own separate additional rebuttal paragraph. Also, you'll notice this has lots of evidence. Some people think, well, you don't need as much evidence or as many quoting of sources in a rebuttal paragraph. That's false. A rebuttal needs just as much evidence and citation of sources as does any other paragraph in the body, right, as any of the confirmation paragraphs. And in fact, you could argue it needs it even more because you're confronting someone. You're saying, hey, you're wrong, so you better be able to back that up. And this has 2 quotes from experts here and here, and then it has a very specific example there. So it has 3 different pieces of evidence, and I would say you need at least 2 different pieces of evidence in any kind of decent body paragraph. And so it does a good job of that, citing it as well. All right, so this is a good rebuttal paragraph. Let's look at E next, so pause the video and then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, E is not a good rebuttal paragraph, and in fact might be the worst one here, because all it is sort of stating generally that the other side is wrong without setting up any specific point, just saying they're wrong overall. You need to say, no, what are they wrong about? And then all it does here is kind of string together quotes without really explaining how that evidence shows that the other side is wrong, right? Let alone how a specific point of theirs is wrong. So most readers, hardly any reader, I would think, could follow that argument. If you aren't explaining how your evidence shows your point, which in this case is that the other side is wrong, then if you don't explain that, the reader won't be able to follow it. So this doesn't have enough analysis. All right. Let's look at F lastly. So take a minute to look at that, and then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, coming back, I bet some people thought that I'd made a mistake. I left F out, and actually I did not. What I want to show here is that some people have no rebuttal at all. So obviously, if you have no rebuttal at all, it's not going to be very good. And that is one of the somewhat common problems people have. And if you're writing an essay that is pro-con, right, it has a pro side, a con side, then you not only need to argue for your side, you need to rebut the other side. So if you don't have any rebuttal, right there, the rebuttal is a failure, obviously. So the good rebuttal here is D, so you can look at that as a model for how to write a proper rebuttal paragraph.